The Siberian ice mummies of the Altai Mountains represent some of the world's most perfectly preserved ancient remains, but their discovery revealed disturbing evidence of ritualistic violence and possible human sacrifice. The Scythian warriors found in these frozen tombs, dating to the 5th century BCE, were covered in elaborate tattoos depicting mythical beasts and preserved so well that their facial expressions of apparent agony remain visible 2,500 years later. Many of the mummies show evidence of violent death: skulls fractured by axes, arrows still embedded in bones, and defensive wounds suggesting they fought desperately before being killed. The permafrost conditions created perfect preservation, maintaining skin, hair, and even stomach contents that reveal their final meals. Some tombs contain multiple bodies arranged in ritualistic positions, with evidence that living servants were buried alongside their masters after being drugged or strangled. The tattoos themselves tell stories of violence, images of predatory animals tearing apart prey, suggesting a culture obsessed with death and warfare. What makes these discoveries particularly haunting is that the ice preserved their clothing, weapons, and personal items so perfectly that archaeologists can see exactly how these ancient people lived and died, creating an eerily intimate connection with warriors who perished over 2 millennia ago in the frozen wasteland of ancient Siberia. Irish folklore's Dullahan represents death's most terrifying messenger, a headless horseman who carries his own severed head under one arm while riding a massive black horse whose hooves strike sparks from the ground. Unlike the headless horseman of American legend, the Dullahan is far more malevolent, using his severed head as a lantern to see in the dark and speaking only to call out the name of someone who is about to die. Witnesses describe the horror of hearing their own name spoken by the disembodied head, which folklore claims is a death sentence that cannot be avoided. The Dullahan is said to stop outside the home of the doomed person and splash them with blood from a basin he carries, marking them for immediate death. His appearance reportedly causes all gates and locks to spring open automatically, meaning no barrier can keep him out when he comes to collect a soul. The most disturbing aspect of Dullahan encounters is that those who see him are struck blind in one eye as punishment for witnessing death's approach, creating a permanent reminder of their supernatural encounter. Irish folklore claims the Dullahan cannot be stopped or reasoned with. He is immune to weapons and appears regardless of weather or obstacles. Some accounts describe him driving a black coach pulled by 6 horses, their harnesses made from human spines, coming to collect multiple souls at once during times of plague or disaster. The 1982 helicopter crash during filming of Twilight Zone the movie created one of Hollywood's most horrific on-set disasters, killing actor Vic Morrow and 2 young children in a scene that was captured on film. The accident occurred during a Vietnam War sequence where Morrow's character was supposed to rescue 2 Vietnamese children from helicopter gunfire, but the helicopter's rotor blade decapitated Morrow and 1 child while crushing the other child to death. The crash was caused by pyrotechnic explosions that were set off too close to the helicopter, disorienting the pilot and causing him to lose control of the aircraft. What made the tragedy worse was that the child actors were hired illegally. They were working past midnight in violation of child labor laws, and their parents were paid under the table to avoid legal restrictions. The film crew had been warned about the dangerous pyrotechnics, but director John Landis ignored safety protocols to achieve a more dramatic shot. The accident was captured on multiple cameras, creating footage so disturbing that it was sealed and only viewed during legal proceedings. Landis and 4 others were charged with involuntary manslaughter but were acquitted despite clear evidence of negligence. The film was completed and released with the fatal scene removed, but the tragedy fundamentally changed Hollywood's approach to on-set safety and the use of children in dangerous sequences. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 transformed French countryside into a landscape where the living fought among the decomposing dead, as constant artillery bombardment unearthed corpses from previous battles and mixed them with fresh casualties. Soldiers reported the psychological horror of digging trenches only to uncover skeletal hands and skulls of comrades killed weeks earlier, their remains becoming building materials for defensive positions. The battle's opening day resulted in 60,000 British casualties, with many wounded soldiers left crying for help in no man's land for days until they died of exposure, thirst, or blood loss while their comrades listened helplessly. Artillery bombardments were so intense that they literally pulverized human bodies, creating a muddy soup of flesh, bone, and soil that soldiers had to live and fight in for months. Rain turned shell craters into pools filled with decomposing body parts, and soldiers were forced to drink from these contaminated sources or die of thirst. The constant bombardment created a phenomenon where buried bodies would be explosively disinterred and reburied repeatedly, with some corpses being blown to pieces and scattered across acres of battlefield. Medical corps workers developed psychological disorders from trying to identify body parts for burial, often collecting fragments in sandbags when complete bodies couldn't be found. The battlefield became so saturated with human remains that farmers continued finding bones and unexploded shells for decades after the war ended. Heath Ledger's death in 2008 was made more tragic by his immersion in the psychopathic mindset of the Joker, a role that reportedly consumed his mental health during filming of The Dark Knight. Ledger locked himself in a hotel room for weeks to develop the character, keeping a diary filled with disturbing images, quotes, and psychological profiles of serial killers and psychopaths. His Joker diary, discovered after his death, contained newspaper clippings about violence, pictures of hyenas, and handwritten notes like chaos and no rules that showed his deep psychological investment in portraying madness. Friends reported that Ledger had difficulty separating himself from the character after filming Wrapped, displaying erratic behavior and insomnia that he tried to treat with prescription medications. The night he died, Ledger was found surrounded by bottles of prescription drugs: OxyContin, Vicodin, Valium, Xanax, Restoril, and Unisum, suggesting he was desperately trying to find sleep and peace from whatever mental turmoil he was experiencing. His masseuse found him unconscious and called Mary-Kate Olsen before calling 911, creating a delay that may have cost him his life. The autopsy revealed acute intoxication from the combined effects of 6 different medications, ruling his death accidental, but highlighting how his method-acting approach to the Joker may have contributed to his psychological deterioration and ultimate demise through pharmaceutical self-medication. The Salem witch trials of 1692 created a legal system where hallucinations and dreams were accepted as proof of guilt, leading to the execution of 20 innocent people based on completely fabricated evidence. The trials relied on spectral evidence, testimony that the accused person's spirit had appeared to witnesses and caused harm, even if the physical person had an alibi. This meant people could be condemned to death based solely on their accuser's claims of supernatural visitations, creating a system where anyone could be murdered through legal channels simply by claiming to have been visited by their ghost. The accused were subjected to physical tests like pressing stones on their chests until they confessed or died, and being thrown into water to see if they floated, indicating guilt, or sank, indicating innocence but often resulting in drowning. Giles Corey, an 80-year-old man, was crushed to death under heavy stones over 2 days because he refused to enter a plea, his final words reportedly being "more weight" as he defied his torturers. The prison conditions were deliberately horrific. Accused witches were chained in dungeons without heat, adequate food, or sanitation, with several dying from exposure and neglect before their trials. Children as young as 4 years old were imprisoned and interrogated, with some confessing to witchcraft simply to escape torture. The trials ended only when accusations reached the governor's wife, suddenly making the court system realize that spectral evidence could be used against anyone, including the powerful. Ancient Egyptians' complex relationship with Nile crocodiles involved both worship and fear, creating a religious practice where priests regularly fed these predators while risking becoming food themselves. Temple records describe ceremonies where priests would wade into crocodile-infested waters to offer food to sacred reptiles, occasionally miscalculating the animal's reach and losing limbs or lives. The crocodiles were considered manifestations of Sobek, the god of fertility, and military prowess. But this reverence didn't prevent them from killing worshippers who ventured too close. Mummified crocodiles found in Egyptian tombs reveal that some specimens reached over 20 feet in length, suggesting the Nile once harbored monster-sized predators capable of taking down adult humans with ease. Archaeological evidence shows that some priests were deliberately fed to crocodiles as the ultimate form of sacrifice, with human remains found in the stomach contents of mummified sacred crocodiles. The crocodile mummification process itself was elaborate, involving removal of internal organs and wrapping in linen, but many specimens show evidence of having recently consumed human flesh before death. Temple walls depict scenes of crocodiles being hand-fed by priests, but also show the aftermath of feeding gone wrong, priests with missing hands attempting to complete rituals while bleeding. The religious significance of these predators created a death cult where being eaten by a crocodile was considered a path to divine favor, encouraging dangerous interactions that regularly resulted in human casualties. The practice of foot binding in Imperial China created a distinctive form of skeletal remains that archaeologists continue to uncover in burial sites, revealing the extent of lifelong torture women endured for beauty standards. The process began when girls were 4 to 6 years old, involving breaking the arch and folding the toes under the foot, then binding them with cloth strips that were progressively tightened over years. Excavated remains show severe bone deformation, with feet literally reshaped into 3 to 4 inch lotus buds that made normal walking impossible. The binding process caused chronic pain, infection, and necrosis, with many women losing toes to gangrene. Burial sites reveal that bound feet were often wrapped separately in silk and placed in special tiny shoes made from precious materials, suggesting these deformed appendages were considered valuable even in death. X-rays of mummified bound feet show bones that were deliberately broken and allowed to heal in grotesque positions, creating feet that resembled animal hooves more than human extremities. The practice was so embedded in culture that women with natural feet were considered unmarriageable, creating a social system where physical mutilation was mandatory for survival. Even in death, these women were buried with their instruments of torture, the binding cloths and shoes that had caused decades of agony, as if their suffering was a source of pride rather than a tragedy to be forgotten. The Chimu civilization of Peru practiced one of history's most systematic forms of child sacrifice, burying hundreds of children in ceremonial wells designed to appease their gods during times of crisis. Archaeological excavations have revealed that these children, ranging from ages 5 to 14, were specially selected for sacrifice based on their physical perfection and then fattened for months before being killed. The sacrificial process involved elaborate ceremonies where children were drugged with coca leaves and chicha beer before being lowered alive into deep wells, then buried under layers of sand and offerings. What makes these discoveries particularly disturbing is evidence that some children attempted to climb out of the wells after being buried, as shown by claw marks in the well walls and positioning of remains near the top of burial layers. The children were often accompanied by young llamas, also sacrificed, creating underground chambers filled with both human and animal remains. Carbon dating reveals that these mass sacrifices occurred during periods of drought or political upheaval, suggesting desperate attempts to change their civilization's fortune through the systematic murder of their most innocent members. The wells were later used as burial sites for adults, creating multi-layered graveyards where children's remains were mixed with those of natural deaths, obscuring the extent of ritualistic killing for centuries. The will-o'-the-wisp phenomenon in English marshlands created one of history's most persistent death traps, luring travelers to their doom with mysterious lights that seem to dance just out of reach. These phosphorescent glows, caused by marsh gases igniting spontaneously, appeared to beckon lost travelers towards safety, but instead led them deeper into treacherous bogs. 18th century accounts describe entire families disappearing after following the lights, their bodies found weeks later, preserved in peat bog conditions that prevented normal decomposition. The bogs acted as natural mummies, maintaining victims' clothing, hair, and even facial expressions of terror as they realized they were sinking into inescapable mud. Some bog bodies discovered centuries later showed evidence that victims lived for hours while slowly sinking, clawing at roots and branches that broke away in their hands. The will-o'-the-wisp became particularly active during foggy nights when travelers were already disoriented, making the false lights seem like genuine salvation. Local legends claimed the lights were spirits of previous victims, condemned to lure others to join them in the marsh. Scientific explanation did little to reduce deaths, as the phenomenon continued to trap people who mistook the natural gas flares for human-made signals, creating an ongoing cycle of death that fed the supernatural reputation of English marshlands. The Great Fire of London in 1666 consumed the city so completely that survivors described the air itself seeming to burn as flames created their own weather systems. The fire burned for 4 days straight, reaching temperatures hot enough to melt church bells and turn stone buildings into lime. Samuel Pepys's diary describes people fleeing with whatever they could carry, only to watch their possessions ignite from the radiant heat before they could reach safety. The fire moved so fast that entire families were trapped in their homes, their charred remains found weeks later when the ruins cooled enough for recovery teams to enter. St. Paul's Cathedral's lead roof melted and poured down into the streets like liquid metal, creating bizarre sculptures of death where it pooled around fleeing people. The River Thames became clogged with boats carrying refugees, many of whom drowned when their overloaded vessels capsized. Bodies thrown into the river to escape the flames were later found cooked by the heat of the water itself. Archaeological excavations have uncovered layers of ash containing household items fused with human bone fragments, creating grotesque artifacts of everyday life interrupted by sudden incineration. The fire's aftermath revealed basement chambers filled with families who had sought shelter underground, only to be slowly roasted alive. The 1982 film Poltergeist became legendary for the mysterious deaths that plagued its cast, leading to speculation about a supernatural curse. Dominique Dunne, who played the eldest daughter, was strangled to death by her ex-boyfriend just months after the film's release. Julian Beck, who played the evil preacher in Poltergeist 2, died of stomach cancer during post-production. Will Sampson, the medicine man character, died of complications after a heart transplant. Most tragically, 12-year-old Heather O'Rourke, the film's star, died of septic shock caused by a bowel obstruction misdiagnosed by doctors as flu. Her death was particularly disturbing because she had been complaining of stomach pain for months before filming Poltergeist 3. The curse rumors were fueled by reports that real human skeletons were used as props in the film's pool scene because they were cheaper than plastic ones, meaning the cast was literally swimming with the dead. Cast members reported feeling uncomfortable on set, with some experiencing nightmares and unexplained illnesses during production. The film's theme of disturbed burial grounds seemed to manifest in real life as the cast members met untimely ends. Hawaii's Molokai leprosy settlement, established in 1866, was essentially a living death sentence where patients were abandoned to die in isolation. The peninsula was chosen specifically because it was surrounded by ocean cliffs on 3 sides, making escape impossible. Patients were literally thrown overboard from ships and forced to swim to shore, with many drowning before reaching land. Those who survived faced a lawless community where the strong preyed on the weak, and medical care was non-existent for the first decade. The settlement's early years were characterized by violence, sexual assault, and cannibalism as desperate residents turned on each other for resources. Children born to leprosy patients were immediately taken away, never to see their parents again. The disease itself caused progressive disfigurement, Fingers and toes would fall off, facial features would collapse, and blindness was common. Patients were forced to dig their own graves when they felt death approaching, as no one else would handle their bodies. The settlement cemetery contains over 8,000 unmarked graves. Even after treatments became available, many patients chose to remain because they had become too disfigured to return to society, living out their days as voluntary prisoners of their own appearance. The mummification of Egyptian priests at Giza involved unique preservation techniques that reflected their sacred status and created some of the most perfectly preserved human remains ever discovered. These religious officials were wrapped in linen inscribed with hieroglyphic spells designed to ensure their spiritual power continued after death. But the physical process was gruesome. Their organs were removed through small incisions and separately mummified in canopic jars, while their brain matter was extracted through the nasal cavity using long bronze hooks. The body cavities were then stuffed with natron salt, spices, and sacred resins to prevent decay. What makes these mummies particularly disturbing is evidence that some priests were mummified while still alive during religious ceremonies, as indicated by defensive wounds and stress patterns in the wrapping. CT scans reveal their mouths were often forced open and filled with molten resin to preserve their ability to speak sacred words in the afterlife. The priests' mummies were buried with scrolls containing curses against anyone who disturbed their rest, and several archaeologists working on these tombs have reported unusual accidents and illnesses. Their perfectly preserved faces still show expressions of what appears to be either ecstasy or agony. Marilyn Monroe's death in 1962 revealed the devastating isolation behind her glamorous public image. Police found her naked body face down on her bed, one hand clutching a telephone as if she had been trying to call for help. The scene was eerily peaceful. Her bedroom was immaculately clean, makeup perfectly applied, suggesting she had prepared for death with the same attention to appearance that defined her life. Toxicology reports revealed lethal levels of chloral hydrate and Nembutal in her system, but the lack of pill residue in her stomach suggested the drugs were administered differently, possibly through an enema, a detail that added disturbing questions about her final hours. Her housekeeper's story changed multiple times, initially claiming she discovered the body at midnight, then changing it to 3 a.m. The delay in calling authorities allowed time for evidence tampering, and crucial items like Monroe's diary mysteriously disappeared. Phone records showed she had made several calls in her final hours, but the recipients were never identified. Her death certificate listed probable suicide, but the circumstances suggested either accidental overdose or something more sinister involving her connections to powerful political figures. 17th century London's pillories were instruments of slow public torture that often resulted in death through deliberate crowd violence. Criminals locked in the wooden stocks faced not just humiliation, but systematic brutality from citizens who pelted them with stones, rotten food, and human waste for days at a time. The design prevented victims from protecting their faces, leading to permanent disfigurement, blindness, and skull fractures. Records show that some pilloried criminals died from infected wounds caused by being struck with sharp objects thrown by angry crowds. The punishment was particularly brutal for those convicted of sodomy or treason, where crowds would sometimes bring hammers and knives to inflict maximum damage. Weather exposure added another layer of torture. Summer heat caused dehydration and heat stroke, while winter conditions led to frostbite and hypothermia. Excavations near former pillory sites have uncovered skeletons showing evidence of multiple healed fractures, suggesting some victims survived initial punishment only to die from long-term injuries. The psychological torture was equally severe, as victims were forced to endure days of verbal abuse and threats while being unable to escape or defend themselves. Tibetan sky burials represent one of humanity's most stark confrontations with mortality, where human bodies are systematically dismembered and fed to vultures on remote mountain platforms. The ritual, called jader, or giving alms to the birds, reflects Buddhist beliefs about the impermanence of physical form, but the process itself is viscerally disturbing. Bodies are brought to designated sites at dawn, where Ragyapas, body breakers, use specialized knives to methodically separate flesh from bone, while vultures circle overhead. The bones are then crushed with hammers and mixed with barley flour to ensure nothing edible remains. Tibetan tradition holds that the vultures are dakinis, sky spirits, that carry the consciousness of the deceased to heaven, but observers describe the feeding frenzy as resembling a scene from nature's most brutal documentaries. The practice serves practical purposes in a landscape where ground burial is impossible due to permafrost, but it requires psychological conditioning that most people cannot achieve. Families must watch their loved ones being consumed, accepting this dismemberment as a final act of generosity. The Exorcist's 1973 production was plagued by inexplicable accidents that convinced cast and crew they were dealing with actual supernatural forces. A mysterious fire destroyed most of the film's sets, delaying production for weeks, yet strangely left the bedroom where the demon possession scenes were filmed completely untouched. 9 people associated with the film died during or shortly after production, including actors Jack McGowan and Vasiliki Maliaros. Ellen Burstyn suffered a permanent spinal injury during filming when she was thrown too hard during a possession scene, her scream of pain making it into the final cut. Refrigeration equipment used to create the cold, visible breath in Regan's bedroom malfunctioned repeatedly, injuring several crew members with frostbite. Mercedes Ruehl, originally cast as Chris McNeil, had to withdraw due to a mysterious illness that doctors couldn't diagnose. The film's ominous tone was amplified by reports of strange sounds and electrical malfunctions in the studio, with some crew members claiming to see shadowy figures that weren't supposed to be there during night shoots. Archaeological excavations at the Royal Cemetery of Ur, 2600 BCE, revealed one of history's most elaborate mass murder scenes disguised as religious ceremony. Queens and kings were buried with their entire retinues, guards, servants, musicians, and courtiers who appeared to have willingly taken poison and arranged themselves in neat rows around their rulers' tombs. Excavations uncovered 74 bodies in Queen Puabi's burial chamber, all adorned in their finest clothes and jewelry, suggesting they dressed for their own deaths. Chemical analysis of the skeletons revealed mercury poisoning, indicating they consumed a toxic substance before lying down to die. The positioning of bodies suggests a carefully orchestrated ritual where each person knew exactly where to die. Musicians were found with their instruments still in playing position, and guards held their spears even in death. Most disturbing is evidence that some attendants were still alive when buried, showing signs of movement in the tomb after soil was placed over them. The practice reflected a belief that servants needed to accompany rulers into the afterlife, creating elaborate underground kingdoms of the dead. Irish folklore's banshee represents death's most terrifying herald, a spectral woman whose wail could drive listeners insane with fear. 19th century accounts describe families hearing her keening cry for hours before discovering a relative had died, sometimes in distant locations. The banshee's appearance varied from a young woman in white to a decrepit hag, but witnesses consistently reported her eyes as blood red from eternal weeping. She was said to appear only to ancient Irish families, bound to them by supernatural obligations that transcended death itself. Documented cases include sightings where multiple family members heard her simultaneously in different locations, all describing identical details of her appearance and the specific tune of her lament. Some accounts describe her as carrying out physical attacks on those who mocked her warnings, leaving scratches that wouldn't heal properly. The most chilling aspect of banshee lore is that she reportedly appeared not just before natural deaths, but also before murders and accidents, suggesting she could see the predetermined moment of death regardless of its cause. Mount Vesuvius's eruption in 79 CE created a uniquely horrific form of preservation, turning Pompeii's residents into detailed casts of their final moments. The pyroclastic flow reached temperatures of 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, instantly vaporizing flesh, while leaving bone structures intact within hardened ash. Archaeologists have discovered families huddled together, their skeletal remains showing they tried to shelter each other from the deadly heat. One famous cast shows a chained dog, twisted in agony as it tried to escape its leash, while volcanic material buried it alive. The speed of death varied throughout the city. Those closest to Vesuvius were killed instantly by the heat, while others suffocated slowly as ash filled their lungs. Bakeries contained carbonized loaves still in ovens, and taverns held the remains of customers who died while drinking. The volcanic ash preserved organic matter so well that archaeologists have found intact brains, though they were turned to glass by the extreme heat. Even more disturbing, some victims appear to have survived long enough to claw at hardening ash around their faces. The 1976 film The Omen became synonymous with death after a series of horrific accidents plagued its production. Lightning struck a plane carrying lead actors Gregory Peck and screenwriter David Seltzer to London, forcing an emergency landing. The same thing happened to director Richard Donner's plane on a separate flight. A hotel where the cast was staying was bombed by the IRA, killing several guests. Most disturbing was the death of special effects designer John Richardson's assistant, who was decapitated in a car crash in the Netherlands, the same method used to kill a character in the film. The crash occurred near a road sign marking the distance to a town called Omen, eerily close to the movie's title. Animal trainer Ray Berwick was mauled by lions during filming, requiring extensive medical treatment. The film's ominous 666 theme seemed to manifest in real life as multiple crew members reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread while working on set, with some quitting mid-production. During the 10-month Battle of Verdun in 1916, the Meuse River became a watery graveyard for supply vessels caught in German artillery barrages. French military logs describe ships drifting unmanned downstream, their crews blown apart by shell fire, decks stained with blood, and fragments of human remains. The constant bombardment created a surreal scene where empty vessels would continue floating for miles, sometimes carrying cargo but no living souls to unload it. Soldiers stationed along the riverbank reported the psychological horror of watching these ghost ships pass by daily, knowing each one represented dozens of dead comrades. The river itself became contaminated with decomposing bodies, both from shipwrecks and soldiers who fell into the water during battles. Recovery teams found vessels with crews still at their posts, killed instantly by shrapnel while maintaining their duties. The accumulated metal debris and human remains in the river created a grotesque mixture that survivors described as sailing through a soup of death and iron. The Black Death of 1347 to 1351 created ghost towns across Europe as entire communities vanished within weeks. In some villages, investigators found no survivors, only skeletal remains scattered in homes where families had barricaded themselves inside to die together. The plague bacillus caused lymph nodes to swell to the size of apples, often bursting and releasing pus and blood. Victims experienced high fever, delirium, and blackened extremities as their circulation failed. Medieval chronicles describe abandoned children wandering streets crying for dead parents until they too succumbed. Mass graves in London reveal bodies thrown in without ceremony, sometimes with lime poured over them to speed decomposition and reduce smell. Some plague pits contained over 2,000 bodies stacked like cordwood. The disease spread so rapidly that survivors often didn't have time to bury the dead properly, leaving corpses to rot in homes, churches, and public squares until authorities could organize disposal crews, who themselves often died before completing their grim task. 18th century Paris faced such severe overcrowding in its cemeteries that gravediggers developed a macabre side business selling human remains to craftsmen. The bones of the poor were dug up at night and sold to artisans who carved them into buttons, combs, and decorative items that wealthy Parisians unknowingly wore. The city's Holy Innocents Cemetery became so packed that bodies were stacked 30 feet deep, with newer corpses placed in mass graves on top of older remains. When heavy rains fell, partially decomposed bodies would surface, creating a horrific landscape of emerging limbs and skulls. The smell became so overwhelming that nearby residents complained to authorities, but nothing was done until the cemetery literally began collapsing under its own weight. When the cemeteries were finally emptied in 1786, over 6 million skeletons were relocated to the catacombs, where their bones were arranged in decorative patterns, turning death into morbid art that tourists still visit today. The Zodiac Killer's reign of terror wasn't just about murder, it was about psychological domination over an entire region. His cryptographic letters sent to newspapers contained bloody pieces of his victims' clothing as proof of authenticity. The killer claimed responsibility for 37 deaths, though only 7 confirmed victims have been linked to him. His coded messages taunted investigators with promises of revealing his identity, but several remain unsolved to this day. Survivors described a methodical killer who seemed to enjoy prolonging their terror, shooting couples in remote areas while wearing an executioner's hood. The famous 408-character cipher, when decoded, revealed his chilling philosophy. He believed killing gave him slaves in the afterlife. Phone calls to police featured a calm, calculated voice describing murder scenes in disturbing detail. His final confirmed letter in 1974 suggested he had gotten bored with killing, leaving authorities wondering if he had simply moved on to other forms of violence or died. Kurt Cobain's death scene in 1994 revealed the stark loneliness of fame's darkest moment. Police found his body in a greenhouse above his Seattle garage, a 20-gauge shotgun beside him, and a note nearby. His final heroin injection showed blood levels 3 times the lethal dose, suggesting he was barely conscious when he pulled the trigger. The electrician who discovered him described seeing Cobain's body through the window for several hours before realizing it wasn't just someone sleeping. His final journal entries, released years later, revealed a man tormented by chronic stomach pain, depression, and the pressure of unwanted celebrity. The guitar he was rumored to be holding when found was actually placed nearby. His final song remained forever unwritten. Toxicology reports showed he had been slowly poisoning himself with drugs for months, his body weight dropping to dangerous levels as he isolated himself from friends and family. The plague of Justinian in 541 to 542 CE transformed Constantinople into a city of the dead. Bodies piled so high that survivors ran out of burial space, forcing them to dig massive bone pits outside the city walls. Archaeological excavations have uncovered these ghastly repositories filled with thousands of skeletons hastily thrown together. The plague killed an estimated 25 to 40% of Constantinople's population, leaving entire neighborhoods eerily silent. Survivors described walking through markets where not a single voice could be heard, only the occasional creak of abandoned wooden stalls. The Hagia Sophia, normally filled with worshippers, echoed with emptiness as priests themselves succumbed. Trade routes became pathways of death as infected rats carried the disease from ship to ship. The empire's tax records from this period show entire provinces simply ceasing to report revenue, not because of rebellion, but because everyone responsible for collection had died.